5,000 sailors stood frozen under a California sun that turned asphalt into a griddle. Not one of them moved. Rear Admiral Voss stood over the woman he had just struck. His hand still raised, his face still arranged into the expression of a man who had never once questioned his own authority. His voice cut across 5 acres of silence like something sharp and irreversible. "Dead weight," he said. "You are everything wrong with this uniform." She did not fall. She did not raise her hands. She did not turn to look at him. She did not make a sound. Blood traced a thin line from her lower lip where his ring had connected, catching the morning light for just a moment before running down her chin. Her head had turned from the force of the blow. That was all. 3 seconds passed. 4. The formation around her was a photograph. 5,000 human beings holding their breath at the same moment without coordination, without being told to, simply because something had happened that none of them knew how to process. Then she straightened. The movement was slow and deliberate and utterly without theater. She brought her spine back to vertical. She squared her shoulders. She set her eyes forward. Her hands stayed at her sides, perfectly still, perfectly composed, as though the last 10 seconds had happened to someone else, and she was simply continuing from where she had left off. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. It did not waver. It did not ask for sympathy or signal distress or reach for anything at all except the words themselves. "Permission to retrieve my sealed personnel file, sir." Voss laughed. The sound bounced off the asphalt and came back wrong. Somewhere in the front formation, a young lieutenant had already stopped breathing. He was staring at her, not at her face, not at the blood on her lip, but at the way she was standing, the way she had absorbed the blow, the way her hands were positioned at her sides. Something in the architecture of her stillness had reached into a part of his training that ran deeper than thought. And the word forming in his mind was not logistics, and it was not specialist, and it was not anything close to what her uniform suggested. He knew that word. He was afraid of what it meant that he knew it. The folder she was about to retrieve would confirm everything. It would end a career that had spanned 3 decades. It would silence 5,000 witnesses in a way that no formation command ever could. And it would uncover a sacrifice so complete, so quietly carried, that most of the people who witnessed what happened that morning would spend years trying to find the right words for it and never quite manage. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, there was only the asphalt and the sun and the blood and the silence, and a woman who had spent 4 years trying to be invisible, standing in the most public moment of her life, holding herself together with the same precision she used for everything else. This is the story of how Maren Cole stopped hiding, and what it cost her, and what it gave back. Naval Air Station Coronado sits on a narrow strip of land south of San Diego, pressed between the Pacific Ocean on one side and San Diego Bay on the other. The base has a particular quality in the hours before sunrise, when the salt air comes in thick off the water, and the floodlights along the main thoroughfare give everything an orange underwater glow. It smells of jet fuel and ocean and the particular institutional cleanliness of a place where people have been following the same routines for decades. In those hours, the base feels like it exists outside of time, like it is simply waiting. Maren Cole woke at 4:47 every morning, not because of an alarm. She had stopped using one years ago somewhere in the process of training her body to operate on its own terms. The clock beside her bunk read 4:47 when her eyes opened, as it had for more mornings than she could count, in more duty stations than she wanted to remember. The number meant nothing in itself. It was simply the time her body had decided was enough. She sat up in the dark and stayed there for exactly 30 seconds. This was not ritual. It was assessment. Her left ear was aching in the way it always ached in the cold hours before dawn, a deep, persistent pressure that no amount of time had fully resolved. She measured the pain the way she measured everything, cataloged it, assigned it a position in the order of things she could and could not change, and moved on. Her right hand was steady. Her left carried a faint tremor that appeared most mornings and disappeared within the first hour of the day. She noted it. The tremor was familiar, and it was not worsening, and it was not something she could fix, so she did not spend time on it. She stood and moved through the small quarters in the dark, navigating by memory, and the faint ambient light seeping under the door. The bandage roll was on the footlocker. It was always on the footlocker. She unwound a length of medical wrap with the efficiency of someone who had performed the same action thousands of times and began to cover her left ear, working the fabric around the outer curve with careful fingers, pausing at a specific point where the scar tissue changed the topography of what should have been smooth cartilage. The damage there was extensive. It followed the curve of her ear and disappeared into her hairline in a path that suggested catastrophic pressure applied in an instant. Old damage. Permanent. The kind that does not improve with time, only becomes familiar. The process took 43 seconds. She had timed it often enough to know. She showered with the efficiency of someone accustomed to shared facilities and limited hot water. When she dressed, her fingers worked the buttons of her logistics corps uniform without requiring her eyes. Muscle memory guiding each motion. She checked her reflection once briefly, the way a carpenter checks a level. Not vanity, verification. The face that looked back was unremarkable in the specific way that people who have spent years cultivating unremarkability learn to cultivate it. Early 30s, no makeup, hair pulled into a regulation bun tight enough to last 12 hours. The bandage around her left ear was barely visible beneath the edge of her cover. She looked like a logistics specialist in the middle of a temporary assignment. She looked like 100 other people on the base. That was the point. She turned to the footlocker. It sat against the wall beside her bunk, standard issue metal, the kind distributed to every enlisted service member at every duty station in the Navy. The combination lock was her own purchase separately, a small assertion of private space, in a world designed to minimize private space. She had owned it for 6 years, and the dial moved under her fingers with the smooth certainty of something used often. 3 objects were inside. She looked at them for a long moment in the pre-dawn dimness, without touching them, without moving, in the particular stillness of someone who has practiced not reacting to something for so long that the stillness itself has become a kind of reaction. The first was a compass, brass military issue, its surface worn smooth with years of handling. The initials that had once been engraved on its face had been filed away, leaving only faint scratches where letters used to be. She had done this herself years ago because seeing the initials every morning was not something she could sustain. But she had left the back intact. A date was etched there in small, precise characters. Halo 7-14, March 21st. The numerals were still sharp. She had not touched that side. The second was a sealed envelope. Manila letter size, its edges yellowed with age, its surface covered in multiple forwarding stamps that documented a journey through military postal systems across several duty stations and several years. The final stamp was dated 6 months prior. She had never opened it. She knew approximately what it contained. She had not yet found the capacity to confirm that knowledge. The third was a dive watch. Tactical grade, expensive, the kind of timepiece designed to function at depths most people would never approach. She kept it wrapped in a thick wool sock at the bottom of the locker so the metal would not click against the sides when she moved the other items. The watch was not something she could explain to anyone who might see it among the possessions of a logistics specialist. She kept it hidden accordingly. She stood there for 30 seconds looking at the 3 objects. Then she closed the footlocker, engaged the combination lock, and spun the dial with 3 sharp clicks. Some days she opened the envelope in her mind, held it in both hands in her imagination, worked the old adhesive loose, unfolded whatever was inside. She never got very far before some part of her closed the door again. 6 months the physical envelope had sat in that locker. She was aware that this was a long time to avoid a piece of mail. She was also aware that she was not ready, and that there was no external deadline on readiness, and that this would remain true until it stopped being true. She went to breakfast. The mess hall operated on its own particular rhythm in the early morning, a rhythm Maren had mapped with the same attention she gave to everything in her environment. She arrived at 5:22, took a tray, filled it with oatmeal and a banana and black coffee, and carried it to the corner table near the emergency exit on the east wall. The same table every morning. From this position, she could see both entrances and most of the room without appearing to surveil either. She ate methodically. Oatmeal first, banana sliced into sections, coffee in measured intervals between bites. Her eyes moved constantly. A group of SEALs occupied 3 tables near the center of the room. They were loud in the comfortable way of people who know they are allowed to be loud, their conversation carrying the specific confidence of elite training and institutional belonging. Their warfare pins caught the fluorescent light. They did not look in her direction. Maren noted them and moved on. She noted the 2 junior officers near the coffee station discussing something on a phone screen with focused urgency. She noted the petty officer by the serving line whose posture suggested he had not slept. She noted the position of every person who entered and every person who left, and she did this without being conscious of doing it the way a musician hears the individual instruments in a piece of music without trying to separate them. She had stopped trying to turn it off years ago. It was faster to let it run and work around it. A metallic crash erupted from the serving station. Someone had dropped a tray. The sound hit the walls and came back hard, a single sharp report that cracked through the ambient noise of the room like a rifle shot at close range. Maren's right hand moved. It moved toward her hip, toward the place where a sidearm would have been holstered in another life, in another uniform, in the person she had spent 4 years trying to become something other than. The motion covered less than 6 inches before her brain caught up with her body and her fingers stopped, and she forced her hand back to the table with the careful deliberateness of someone applying pressure to a wound. The entire sequence lasted less than a second. She was reasonably confident no one had seen it. She was wrong. At the beverage station, a young SEAL lieutenant had been watching her since she sat down. Not with particular intention, not because he recognized her, but because there was something about the way she moved through a room that registered in a part of his training designed to register exactly that. He had been watching her eat and thinking that there was something off about the corner table, something about the way her eyes moved. When her hand went for her hip, he stopped thinking and started looking. He watched her force her hand back to the table. He watched her face show nothing at all. He stood at the beverage station for a long moment, after that his own coffee cooling in his hand, and then he reached for his phone and started to type something into the search bar and then stopped. He was not sure what he was searching for. The thought was half-formed, more feeling than fact, the sense of a word in another language he had heard once and could not quite retrieve. He put his phone away. Maren stood and cleared her tray. She walked past him without making eye contact, her path through the dispersing breakfast crowd fluid and precise, navigating around bodies and tables with the casual ease of someone accustomed to moving through more complicated environments. The lieutenant stood at the beverage station for another 30 seconds after she left. Then he went to join his table, and the half-formed thought dissolved into the ordinary noise of the morning, and he did not retrieve it until he needed to. The supply warehouse occupied a long concrete building at the eastern edge of the base. It smelled of cardboard and machine oil, and the particular mustiness of equipment stored in bulk for long periods. Fluorescent lights ran the length of the ceiling in parallel rows, casting everything in flat, even light that makes time feel suspended. Maren arrived at 700 hours and began work without preamble. She was 6 weeks into a temporary assignment at Coronado, rotating through as part of the medical reintegration program that had been managing her separation from active duty for the past 4 years. The program placed service members with significant medical limitations into support roles across different bases, allowing them to continue contributing within physical parameters that precluded their previous duties. On paper, Maren Cole was a logistics specialist, second class, temporarily assigned hearing-impaired, unremarkable. She worked the inventory manifest with the efficiency of someone for whom systematic task was deeply familiar. Barcode scanning, quantity verification, lot number cross-referencing. Straightforward work, repetitive, the kind that allowed a portion of her attention to remain elsewhere while her hands kept moving. But the way she organized the supplies told a different story to anyone paying attention. She had, over the past 6 weeks, quietly restructured the warehouse layout. Not dramatically, not in any way that generated formal complaints, but methodically, shelf by shelf, in the margins of her assigned duties. Night vision batteries near the front access points. Medical supplies grouped by trauma classification rather than alphabetical order. Communication equipment stacked according to deployment frequency and operational priority. The system made immediate sense to anyone who had ever needed to locate specific equipment in the first 90 seconds of an unexpected situation. It made no sense at all as a filing system for a routine supply warehouse on a domestic base. Chief Warren Briggs noticed on a Tuesday. He was a large man with 15 years in logistics and the particular confidence of someone whose expertise had never been seriously challenged. He walked over to where Maren was reorganizing a section of radio equipment and looked at what she had done with the expression of someone who has come home to find the furniture rearranged. "What are you doing?" Maren did not look up, making the arrangement more efficient. "We go alphabetical. That's the system. This way, critical items are accessible first. In an emergency, mobilization response time improves by approximately 40%. Briggs stared at her. "When was the last emergency mobilization here?" "September 2019. "That was 5 years ago." "Yes." She examined a battery pack, checking the seal with her thumb. "One time was enough to establish a baseline." Briggs watched her for another moment. He watched the way her hands moved over the equipment, the specific way she tested connections and seals, the way her attention distributed itself across the items she was checking, with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what the failure of each component could mean in practice. He was watching a person who knew this equipment from the inside out, from the operational end, from the end where failure has consequences that the supply chain never sees directly. "You trying to play operator or something?" he said. "You're logistics." Maren said nothing. She continued working. Briggs left without saying anything else. But he kept watching her in the days that followed with the quiet attention of a man who has realized he may have misunderstood something significant. At 1100 hours, Lieutenant Commander Paul Nettles arrived with a clipboard. He was a thin man in his late 40s with wire-rimmed glasses in the permanent posture of someone who had spent most of his career behind a desk. He was not unkind. He was not particularly perceptive. He executed administrative functions competently and without imagination, which was the majority of what his role required. Hale, you're being reassigned for the next 3 days. Parade ground detail. Admiral's inspection ceremony Friday. The muscles along Maren's jaw tightened by a fraction. I would prefer to remain on current assignment, sir. Not a request. Admiral Voss wants all hands for the ceremony. 5,000 personnel, visiting dignitaries. He handed her a packet of papers without looking up from his clipboard. Report to the parade ground at 0600 tomorrow for rehearsal. Uniform inspection at 1700 today. Understood, sir. Nettles turned to leave, paused, turned back. Try to blend in, Hale. Just stand where they put you and follow orders. Should be straightforward enough. He said it with the tone of a man delivering genuine practical advice. After he left, Maren stood holding the papers. Her fingers gripped the edges hard enough to create small wrinkles in the page. She was not thinking about Nettles, she was thinking about Rear Admiral Harlan Voss, whose reputation had preceded his arrival at Coronado by several months. 26 years as a SEAL, multiple combat deployments, an institutional record that described zero tolerance for weakness in the particular way that institutions describe zero tolerance when they admire it. Personnel who had served under Voss described him in the specific terms that people use when they are choosing their words carefully because the alternative words are not ones they want on record. She forced herself to release the papers. The tremor in her left hand was briefly visible before she made a fist and held it until it stopped. 3 days. Then she would rotate to the next assignment. She picked up her inventory scanner and went back to work. That evening, sitting on the edge of her bunk with the last of the daylight filtering through the narrow window, Maren opened the footlocker. 3 right, 2 left, 1 right. The mechanism released with its familiar soft click. She looked at the 3 objects. She looked at them for a long time. Then she reached in and took the compass. It was heavier than it looked, which was true of most brass objects, and especially true of this one, which had been made in an era when precision tools were built to last rather than to be replaced. She turned it in the fading light, watching the shadows shift across the filed surface where the initials used to be. The man whose initials she had filed away had been a logistics officer. Not special operations, not a shooter, not someone whose name appeared in classified briefings or medal citations. He had managed supply chains for 3 deployments and had done it with the specific excellence of someone who understood that the difference between a good logistics officer and a poor one was the difference between people coming home and people not coming home. He had given her the compass on a night in a forward operating location when she was 26 years old, and neither of them knew whether they would be alive in the morning. He had pressed it into her hand and said something about north always being north, regardless of where you were standing, and she had put it in her chest pocket, and she had been wearing it when the helicopter went down. He had not been on the helicopter. He had been somewhere safer. And then, through the nature of the work they did, he was not safe, and then he was gone, and the compass was the only thing left. She had filed the initials because seeing them every morning was not something she could sustain. But the date on the back she had never touched. She turned it over. Halo 714, March 21st. 4 years. She pressed the flat of the compass against her sternum and closed her eyes. The memory came in fragments, as it always did. The helicopter interior lit red. The weight of full tactical gear familiar and grounding. Someone screaming into the radio. The aircraft dropping. Her own voice cutting through the noise, calm and operational, giving instructions to people who were panicking, keeping them functional through sheer force of directed authority. I'm going back for them. Mark my position, do not follow. She opened her eyes. She was breathing harder than she should be. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold. She put the compass down and picked up the envelope. 6 months. She had carried this through 2 duty stations. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The adhesive on the seal had dried and would tear easily. She applied pressure to the edge. She put it back. Not tonight. She retrieved the encrypted phone from beneath the loose board under her bunk. Older model, small and utilitarian, designed for function over form. She powered it on, waited, and navigated to the single contact. No name, just a number she had memorized years ago. She typed, still holding position. 36 hours. She read the message twice. Then she pressed send and powered the phone off and returned it to its place. The dive watch sat in its sock at the bottom of the locker. She did not retrieve it. She locked the footlocker, spun the dial, and sat in the growing dark listening to the helicopters conducting night operations somewhere over the bay. Their rotors carried through the walls at the specific frequency that her damaged ear processed differently from her right, a low resonance she felt as much as heard. She had learned to sit with the sound without her body running the full cascade of responses it had run without her control for the first year after Morocco. The conditioning had taken a long time. It was not complete, but it was better. She prepared for sleep with the same precision she brought to everything else. She did not sleep well. Now comes the part of this story that requires going backward before it can go forward. Because Maren Cole did not exist in isolation. No one does. And to understand what happened on that parade ground, you have to understand the man on the other side of it. You have to understand what he was carrying and why he was carrying it, and how a person arrives at the place where authority becomes something they use against others because they cannot use it against themselves. In 1997, Harlan Voss was 25 years old and failing. This is not a word that appears in his service record because the Navy does not use that word, but the Navy does have other words, and the words that appeared in his assessments during that period were words like inconsistent and lacks demonstrated commitment and does not yet meet the physical and psychological standards expected of candidates at this stage of training. He was on the edge of being removed from the program. He had been on that edge for weeks, and everyone around him knew it, and the knowing had its own particular weight. The instructor who took particular interest in his case conducted Voss's assessment in front of the assembled training class. He made his observations at the volume appropriate for ensuring they were clearly heard by everyone present. He said that Voss was weak. He said this specifically and with the particular emphasis of someone who believes that naming a thing publicly is the most efficient way to motivate a person to change it. Harlan Voss stood in that formation and heard himself described as weak in front of his peers, and he made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of his life. The decision was this: he would become the kind of person that instructor could never call weak again. He would become harder than the standard required. He would apply maximum pressure to everything and everyone around him and call that pressure excellence, and he would not stop applying it. Because stopping meant that somewhere the accusation from that formation still held. He completed the program. He excelled. He became, over the following 26 years, one of the most decorated officers in naval special warfare. His operational record was genuine and significant. The commendations he wore were earned under conditions that most people have the good sense never to seek out. But inside the record, invisible to the citations and the promotion boards, was the formation from 1997. The instructor's voice, the weight of a single word spoken in public and allowed to settle into the foundation of everything built afterward. Harlan Voss had spent 26 years trying to outrun that word, and in the process he had become, without ever noticing the transformation, the instructor. The man at the front of the formation, using volume and public exposure to enforce a standard that was no longer about excellence and had not been for some time. A standard that had become somewhere in the intervening decades about ensuring that other people felt what he had felt in 1997, because if they felt it and survived it, that meant he had been right to survive it. He could not have told you any of this. He did not know any of this. Most people do not know the architecture of their own oldest wounds. What he knew on the morning of the ceremony at Coronado was that he had 5,000 personnel to inspect, and a reputation to maintain, and standards to enforce. What he did not know was that the woman in the rear left quadrant of the Logistics Corps formation had 3 times entered a submerged helicopter in hostile waters to retrieve the men trapped inside. What he did not know was that his own name appeared on a document inside her sealed file. What he did not know was that the decision he had made in 1997 to never again be the person named as weak had led him in a straight and invisible line to this moment on this parade ground. He would make the worst mistake of his career publicly in front of 5,000 witnesses on a day when several of those witnesses had phones in their pockets. And the woman he struck would stand back up, square her shoulders, and say 4 words that would dismantle everything he had built. But that is still ahead. Right now, it is still the night before, and Maren Cole is lying on her bunk in the dark, listening to helicopters over the bay, thinking about 3 objects in a locked box and a name she has spent 4 years trying to set down. She is thinking that 3 days is not very long. She has held things together for much longer than 3 days under much worse conditions. At 4:47, she gets up. The parade ground at Naval Air Station Coronado covers 10 acres of flat asphalt, and at 05:30 on a Friday morning in late summer, it holds 5,000 people, the way a pan holds water right up to the edge. No room for anything that does not belong. Maren arrived early. She found her position in the rear left quadrant of the Logistics Corps section and settled into parade rest. Around her, personnel were making the small adjustments that precede a formal inspection, checking spacing, straightening covers, running thumbs along ribbon edges. She did not adjust anything. Her uniform required no adjustment. She had checked all of it at 0450 in her quarters because preparation executed before the moment of pressure is the only preparation that counts. Her eyes moved. She tracked the positions of the medical personnel, placing themselves at intervals along the formation perimeter. She noted the wind direction coming in from the southwest off the bay, which meant the heat building off the asphalt would accumulate rather than disperse as the morning progressed. She identified the location of the reviewing platform and calculated her sightline to it from her current position, roughly 240 feet, sufficient to observe clearly without being in the primary field of observation. The temperature at 0600 was already 78 degrees. The forecast had called for 95 by midday. The ceremony was scheduled to conclude at 1100. The mathematics of that combination were not favorable to 5,000 people standing in wool and polyester on 10 acres of heat-retaining asphalt with no shade and limited hydration access. A command voice cut through the morning air. Formation attention. 5,000 people snapped to attention as one. The sound that produced was not like anything else. It was the compression of thousands of individual sounds into a single moment, a physical event that moved across the asphalt like a pressure wave. Maren's body executed the movement with the automatic precision of someone who has stood in more formations than she can easily count. Weight forward, hands at her sides, eyes front. Her breathing shifted. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Her body preparing for stress before her conscious mind finished assessing the situation. The formation held. The sun continued its work. Rear Admiral Harlan Voss arrived at 0615 in a staff car that pulled to the reviewing platform with deliberate ceremony. He emerged in full-service dress, his chest carrying the accumulated weight of 26 years expressed in ribbons and devices and the specific authority of a man who has never been uncertain about his own judgment. He moved to the podium. He did not use the microphone. His voice carried without it. He spoke about standards. He spoke about discipline. He spoke about what the ceremony represented for visiting dignitaries from allied nations and what it would mean to perform it with anything less than absolute precision. He spoke about weakness as though it were a communicable disease that he had dedicated his career to containing. When he stepped down and began walking through the ranks, Commander Elliot Shaw followed at the appropriate distance, his clipboard held against his chest, his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who has learned that visible reactions to his commander's actions create problems that take longer to solve than they take to create. Voss moved through the front formations with the focused attention of someone who has been doing this long enough that the search for fault has become reflexive. He stopped in front of a Marine Staff Sergeant and identified a 3mm discrepancy in ribbon alignment. He stopped in front of a petty officer and critiqued the angle of a cover. He made a junior officer recite general orders from memory and interrupted him twice to note where his cadence suggested uncertainty. Each correction was public. Each correction was designed to be heard by the people on either side of the person being corrected. This was not incidental. This was the method. In the rear left quadrant, Maren watched. She did not move. She did not react visibly to anything she observed. But her assessment of what she was watching was running at full capacity, noting the pattern of Voss's approach through the formations, noting the way he selected targets, noting the consistency of his method. She had encountered this particular leadership philosophy before in various forms, and she understood its internal logic even as she understood its costs. By 0700, the temperature had crossed 80 degrees. The asphalt was beginning to generate visible heat shimmer at the far end of the formation. The first sailor collapsed at 0745. He went down sideways in the third row, his body making a sound against the asphalt that was immediately identifiable to anyone who had heard it before as the sound of a person who is no longer choosing to be upright. The medical corpsman moved immediately professional and practiced loading him onto a stretcher and clearing him from the formation in under 90 seconds. The gap closed. The formation continued. Voss did not pause. 3 more sailors went down in the next 40 minutes. Then 2 Marines. Each time the formation absorbed the gap and continued. Each time Voss registered the event with approximately the same attention he would have given to a cloud passing in front of the sun. Maren was tracking the personnel around her. She had been tracking them for the past hour with the same automatic assessment she brought to everything in her environment, measuring hydration status by skin tone and the quality of small involuntary movements, calculating heat injury, progression based on temperature, duration, uniform weight, and individual physiological signals. She had identified 3 sailors in positions adjacent to hers who were showing early indicators of heat exhaustion. She had been watching all 3. She could not intervene without drawing attention to herself. She held her position and she watched, and she continued to calculate, and the part of her that was still and would always be the person she had been before logistics measured the distance between what she was observing and what she was not doing about it. The sailor 2 rows ahead began to sway at 0900. Maren saw it before anyone else did. The subtle shift in his weight distribution, the way his head had moved incrementally forward over the past 8 minutes, the color change visible even at this distance. He had maybe 60 seconds. Her weight shifted forward onto the balls of her feet. She caught herself, forced her weight back to regulation distribution. Not her mission. She was logistics temporary anonymous. She held her position. The sailor collapsed 32 seconds later. Medical personnel responded immediately. Maren watched and held still, and the part of her that had trained for 12 years to respond to exactly this kind of situation kept its own counsel, and the cost of that silence was something she added to the account she kept with herself. At 0945, Voss reached the logistics core section. Maren was in the 4th row. She was by any reasonable assessment the least visually distinctive person in her immediate area. Her uniform was regulation, her bearing was textbook, her spacing was correct. She had positioned herself to present nothing remarkable. Voss stopped in front of her. She did not know why. She would think about this later, and she would not arrive at a satisfying answer, because sometimes the variables that determine which person a man like Voss selects as an example are too small and too numerous to isolate. Perhaps it was the intensity behind her eyes that she had never fully learned to suppress. Perhaps it was the quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of someone trying not to be noticed, but the stillness of someone who had learned to be very quiet inside a great deal of capacity. Whatever the reason, he stopped. State your rate and assignment. Logistics Specialist, 2nd class, sir. Temporary assignment from the Medical Reintegration Program. Voss looked at her with the focused attention of someone whose professional purpose is the identification of inadequacy. Medical reintegration. What happened? Hearing damage, sir. Training injury. Hearing damage. He said it with a particular quality of voice that reduced the information to its most convenient interpretation. Let me guess. Fell wrong during a drill, hurt your delicate ear. Now you rotate through supply warehouses on the taxpayer's dime. Maren said nothing, eyes forward, hands at her sides. I asked a question, specialist. The injury occurred during advanced combat life-saving training, sir. Inner ear damage from blast over pressure. Voss's eyes narrowed. Advanced combat life-saving. That's medic training. Logistics specialists don't attend advanced medic courses. Cross-training program, sir. He began to circle her, a slow circuit, close to the kind of movement designed to communicate that every inch of her was subject to his assessment. Her uniform gave him nothing. Her bearing gave him nothing visible. He completed the circuit and stopped on her left side. He spoke directly into her damaged ear. His voice was parade ground volume directed at the side of her head that processed sound at roughly 60% capacity. The consonants that her damaged cochlear structures could no longer fully distinguish smeared together into a pattern she had to reconstruct from context. She caught the opening words. She caught the closing words. The middle of the command fragmented into the particular acoustic noise that her left ear produced in place of clarity. She processed what she had. She assembled the most probable version of the command from the fragments available. She hesitated. 2 seconds. 3. Voss's face changed. Did you just refuse a direct order? Sir, I did not clearly hear. Excuses. His voice cut across hers with the finality of a door closing. Weakness presenting itself as limitation. That's what you are. You stand here occupying space while real sailors serve. You represent exactly what happens when we lower our standards to accommodate people who should have been separated years ago. The formation around them had gone completely silent. Not the silence of attention being paid elsewhere, but the silence of attention converging on a single point. 5,000 people had stopped making the small adjustments of people enduring prolonged formation, standing, and had become something closer to statues held in place by the particular social gravity of a public confrontation they did not know how to navigate. Maren held her bearing. Her jaw was set. Her hands were still. The thing rising inside her was not anger or not only anger. It was the specific pressure of something that had been held down for a long time beginning to move against its containment, the sensation of 4 years of careful construction beginning to develop fractures under load. She recognized it. She held the bearing anyway. Voss saw something in her eyes. He was a man who had spent 26 years reading people under pressure, and what he saw was not the look of a logistics specialist enduring correction. What he saw was something that did not fit the narrative he had already assembled about her, something that complicated the story, and it enraged him in the specific way that complications enrage people who have decided they already understand a situation. He struck her, open-handed across her right cheek, his ring making contact with her lower lip. The sound carried across the parade ground like a shot. The formation froze. Maren's head turned from the force of it. That was all. She stood on 10 acres of asphalt in 90 degrees of California sun, with 5,000 witnesses and blood beginning to trace a line from her lip, and she stayed exactly where she was. She did not raise her hands. She did not make a sound. Inside, in the part of herself that she had spent 4 years trying to protect, she closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. And in that second, she was not on a parade ground. She was on the surface of water so cold it registered as pain rather than temperature. And she was making a calculation, the same calculation she had made 3 times that night, how much air remained in her lungs against how far down the fuselage had settled, whether the numbers worked. They had worked all 3 times. She had made them work. The cost of making them work was standing on a parade ground 4 years later with blood on her lip and 5,000 people watching, and a man who did not yet know what his name meant on the 3rd page of her file. She opened her eyes. She squared her shoulders. She brought her head back to center. She did not wipe the blood, and she did not acknowledge it, and she did not look at Harlan Voss. Then she spoke, quietly, without theater. "Permission to retrieve my sealed personnel file, sir." The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had preceded it that morning. This one had weight and texture, the silence of 5,000 people encountering something they did not have a category for. Voss laughed. The laugh was wrong, and everyone heard that it was wrong. "Your personnel file." He looked back at Shaw, whose clipboard had stopped moving. "She thinks paperwork is going to save her." "Permission to retrieve my sealed personnel file, sir." Identical cadence, identical tone. Shaw had heard the word sealed this time. His face changed in a way he did not intend. He looked down at his clipboard, then back at Maren, then at Voss with the expression of a man who has realized he may be standing on ground he has not adequately assessed. Voss waved his hand. "Go ahead, bring your participation trophy. Let everyone watch." Maren rendered a salute. The movement was textbook, precise, held for exactly the duration the manual prescribed. The salute of someone who has performed that movement 10,000 times in every condition imaginable, who could perform it correctly at the end of a 48-hour operation in the dark, in the water, after things had gone wrong in ways that most people in this formation had never been asked to contemplate. Voss returned it. Maren executed an about-face, and then she walked. The logistics specialist's careful, unremarkable movement was simply gone. What replaced it was something that several of the personnel watching could identify by name, and could not have explained how they knew the name, the particular quality of someone moving through a space, not as a pedestrian, but as an operator. Each step placed with mechanical efficiency, head position providing maximum environmental awareness while appearing to face straight ahead. She covered the 240 feet to the command tent with a purposefulness that communicated to anyone fluent in the relevant language that she had covered longer distances under worse conditions and had always known where she was going. Lieutenant Dawson Reed was in the SEAL section 4 rows from the front. He had been watching her since the moment Voss stopped in front of her. Not because he recognized her face. He had been watching because of the strike itself, because of what he had seen in the 3 seconds after the strike when her head was turned and she was not yet upright again. He had seen that before. That specific quality of absorption, the way the body takes impact and roots it somewhere internal, rather than expressing it outwardly the way the muscles engage in a sequence that is not instinctive, but train the way the hands stay controlled and the breathing stays managed and the affect stays level, even while the body is responding to violence. He had seen it in debris footage from operations he was not authorized to have seen, footage shown to his unit in the context of a classified review 2 years prior. He had seen a name in that briefing document. He had seen a service photograph. He had been told that the person in the photograph had sustained injuries inconsistent with continued service in her operational capacity, that she had been medically separated, that her records were restricted, and that what she had done on the night of March 14, 2021, was something his unit was being briefed on because it represented a standard of operational commitment that warranted institutional preservation even if it could not be institutionally acknowledged. He was looking at that photograph now. She was older. She was thinner. The ear was bandaged, and the expression was different, had been different every time he had watched her move through a room, a flatness that he now understood was not blankness, but compression. The look of someone carrying a very great deal of weight and distributing it so evenly across their entire person that it becomes invisible until you know how to look for it. He knew how to look for it. "Oh God," he said, and his voice was barely breath. He said it to no one. He said it because the situation required something to be said, and that was the thing his mind produced. He had watched something wrong happen. He had stood in formation and watched it happen and done nothing, and this fact was going to stay with him for a long time. He did not know that yet, standing there with his face drained of color. But it would become something he returned to on a regular basis, the specific texture of that moment, the weight of almost of reaching for something and stopping before the reach became action. The space where he had stood was very loud with his silence. The command tent was 40 feet deep and smelled of canvas and recycled air. Two administrative personnel were working at field desks when Maren entered. She did not break stride. "I need my sealed personnel file. Authorization code Delta 7 Zulu." The petty officer at the near desk blinked. "Ma'am, that's a special operations classification code. We'd need authorization from—" "I'm providing the authorization, Delta 7 Zulu. Verify it now." Something in her voice made the petty officer move immediately. He accessed the secure database. He typed the code. He read what appeared. His face became very still, the way faces become still when processing information larger than the category they had prepared for it. He looked up at the staff sergeant. "Sergeant Holloway, I need the red stripe safe." The staff sergeant set down his pen. "The what?" "Red stripe safe, now." They moved to a locked cabinet in the corner. Inside was a smaller safe with diagonal red stripes across its face. The combination took Holloway's full attention. The lock released. Inside were 3 folders, each with the same red striping on their edges, each bearing classification stamps layered like geological strata. The petty officer checked the designations and pulled one folder. His name was Fletcher Dunn, and what was happening inside him at this moment was not visible on his face because he was trained to maintain composure in situations that produced the impulse to lose it, but it was happening with the full force of everything it contained. 4 years ago, Fletcher Dunn's family had received a letter. The letter had come from a Naval Special Warfare Command address, and it had told his family that the service member who had entered a submerged aircraft to retrieve his brother Bryce on the night of March 14, 2021, had not survived the operation. That service member's identity was restricted for operational security. His family had been told only that someone had gone back for Bryce and had brought him out, and had not come back from the water herself. His mother had planted a white oak. She had chosen it because white oaks live for 500 years. She had wanted the acknowledgement to outlast the forgetting. Fletcher Dunn was looking at the person the tree was for. She was standing in the command tent with blood on her lip and a bearing that had not altered by a single degree. She was looking at him with eyes that were waiting patient, prepared for whatever came next. He crossed the tent and handed her the folder with both hands. The way you hand something to someone when you understand what it represents. She took it. She looked at him for exactly one moment, one long, careful moment of mutual recognition that neither of them commented on, and then she turned and walked back out into the sun. She walked back across the parade ground carrying the folder. She did not need to change anything about the way she moved. The folder said everything the walk had already been saying, and now 5,000 people had the language to read both at once. Shaw watched her from the platform and stopped writing anything on his clipboard. Reed watched from his row with the expression of a man who has understood something irreversible. Voss watched her come and did not laugh this time. Maren stopped 3 paces from the reviewing platform. She rendered a salute. Voss returned it with barely concealed irritation. She placed the folder on the podium. Then she stepped back 3 precise paces, stood at attention, and waited. Voss reached for the folder with dismissive confidence. He opened it. His hand stopped on the first page. The Navy Cross citation was 3 paragraphs. The first established context. The second described actions. The third described consequences. Voss had read documents like this before, had read many of them over 26 years, but the specific combination of elements in this document, the number of extractions, the conditions, the duration, the outcome, and its cost occupied a category that most documents in his experience did not reach. He turned to the second page. His hands had changed. Something in the mechanism of them had shifted, some quality of steadiness that had been present all morning. Shaw read over his shoulder. Shaw took 1 step backward. His hand moved to his chest in the involuntary gesture of a person whose body is expressing something their training has not given them language for. Reed broke formation. He moved forward from the SEAL section with the directness of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it, stopped at the edge of the reviewing platform area, and rendered a salute toward Maren Cole from 30 yards away. His arm was straight, his hand was steady. He held it. A SEAL captain in Reed's row read the situation in Reed's posture and in Shaw's face and in the way Voss was holding the folder, and he stepped forward and rendered his own salute. Then another, then three more, then an entire row. The salutes moved through the front formations the way a wave moves through water. Not because anyone was coordinating it, not because anyone gave an order, but because information was moving through the formation, the way it always moves through a concentrated group of people, person to person, word to word, and the information was producing in each person who received it the same response. The response of a person who has just understood that they have been looking at something for hours without seeing what it was. Within 90 seconds, the front third of 5,000 people was rendering honors to a logistics specialist standing on hot asphalt with a bleeding lip and the bearing of someone who had earned the right to that bearing in water and darkness and cold. Voss was on the third page. The third page was not the citation. It was a document that had been classified for 4 years, restricted for reasons described as operational security, filed in a place where it would not surface unless someone with the correct authorization code requested it specifically. The third page was the Medal of Honor recommendation, which had been written in full and submitted through proper channels and denied, and the denial had been filed with the recommendation. And the reason for the denial was not operational security. The reason was in a supporting document that identified the source of the intelligence failure that had caused the helicopter to be in the wrong airspace at the wrong moment on the night of March 14, 2021. The document listed the officer who had reviewed and approved the faulty intelligence assessment, Commander Harlan Voss, 2021. He had not known. This was true. The intelligence had passed through multiple channels, and he had been one of 7 officers who had reviewed and approved it, and no formal proceeding had ever established individual culpability. The inquiry had concluded with systemic findings, and the files had been classified, and the recommendation had been denied, and the woman who had gone into the water 3 times to recover the men, the faulty intelligence had put in the wrong airspace, had been medically separated, and had disappeared into the bureaucratic structure of the reintegration program. He had not known. He knew now. He was holding the folder in both hands, and the folder was shaking with the slight, unsteady movement of hands that are no longer fully under the control of the person attached to them, and he was looking at a name he had signed under conditions that had seemed at the time like ordinary work, the ordinary compression of information and judgment that makes up the daily functioning of command at his level. And that name had propagated forward through 4 years and 10,000 miles into this parade ground, and this moment in this woman 3 paces away. Maren was watching him. She had known about the third page for 4 years. She had read the inquiry findings in the hospital when she still had tubes in her arm, and the full extent of the damage to her ear was still being assessed. She had read the name, and she had put the documents away, and she had said nothing to anyone. And she had spent 4 years building a life around the fact that the account was not balanced and never would be, and that the only productive thing she could do with that knowledge was to set it down and walk away from it. She was not certain she had fully managed the setting down. She was certain she was not going to do anything with this moment except stand in it and let it be what it was. Voss looked up from the folder. He looked at her. She held his gaze steadily without expression, with the patience of someone who has learned that the most powerful thing you can do in a situation where power is being weaponized against you is to simply remain present in a way that cannot be argued with. The salutes continued spreading behind her. Voss's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the folder. He looked at his own name on the third page. He looked at the woman standing 3 paces from him and the entire architecture of the morning, the standards and the corrections and the zero tolerance, and the certainty was restructuring itself into something he had no prepared framework for. Shaw's voice was barely a sound. "Admiral, you need to render honors now." Voss's hand rose slowly toward his forehead. The movement was nothing like the crisp command authority he had demonstrated all morning. It was uncertain and incomplete and human in a way that his movements had not been. His hand reached his forehead and stayed there, shaking slightly. Maren held the salute for 3 full seconds. Then she lowered it with the same textbook precision she had maintained through everything executed in about-face and walked off the parade ground. Behind her, Shaw was already on his radio. His voice was controlled and professional and carried under its surface the particular urgency of someone who understands that what has just happened requires immediate management at a level above his authority to provide. Reed was still holding his salute in the direction Maren had walked even after she had disappeared around the edge of the far building. He held it for another 3 seconds. Then he lowered it and stood looking at the space where she had been calculating what it would cost him to live with what he had understood too late. She walked until the parade ground was behind her and the sound of Shaw's radio voice had faded, and the only sounds were her own footsteps on the path between buildings and the distant rotors of a helicopter completing its morning training circuit over the bay. She walked without destination, which was unusual for her. She had moved through the past 4 years with a precision of purpose that left no space for undirected movement. Purposeful movement was control. Control was the thing that kept everything else in its assigned position. She walked anyway. The base continued its operations around her with the indifference of large institutions to the private crises of individuals. Vehicles moved between buildings. Personnel crossed her path at intersections and nodded and moved on. The machinery of military service ground forward because it was designed to continue regardless of what any individual within it was experiencing. She found herself at the eastern edge of the base, standing near the chain-link fence that separated the installation from the narrow road running parallel to the bay. The water was visible through the fence, gray-green in the morning light, moving with the small, consistent chop of a body of water that does not pay attention to what is happening on its shore. The blood on her lip had dried. Her face had swollen on the right side where Voss's ring had connected a deep throb pulsing in time with her heartbeat that she had been filing under manageable for the past 2 hours. She touched the swelling carefully with 2 fingers, assessing, and then stopped touching it because assessment was not what she needed from herself at this moment. What had happened on the parade ground was finished. The file was open. The file had always been going to open eventually, or she had known this at some level. She did not examine directly because secrets of that magnitude do not remain contained indefinitely. They find their way out through the available pressure points. 4 years. She had spent 4 years constructing a version of herself that did not require the file, a version that functioned within the limits the injuries had imposed, that found purpose in work that no one would mistake for heroism, that moved through institutional spaces without generating attention, that produced questions she could not answer without opening things she was not ready to open. The version had been functional. The version had been useful. The version was gone now, dissolved in 90 seconds on 10 acres of asphalt. And what she was standing here with was the question of what came next. She did not have an answer. This was unusual. She normally had an answer. She stood by the fence and watched the water and gave herself the time to not have one. The knock came at her quarters door at 1900. She had returned an hour earlier, changed out of her dress uniform, sat on the edge of her bunk with the footlocker open in front of her without removing anything from it. This cycle had repeated several times without resolution. When the knock came, she was sitting at the small desk with her logbook open to a blank page, a pen in her hand, nothing written. She opened the door. Commander Elliot Shaw was in the corridor. Standing beside him, not in uniform, wearing civilian clothes, with the specific discomfort of someone whose body has long since decided that civilian clothes are a foreign language. It tolerates rather than speaks, was Rear Admiral Harlan Voss. He looked smaller than he had on the parade ground. Not physically, but something in the distribution of his presence had changed some quality of occupation that had been present in his bearing all morning, and that was not present now. He looked like a man who had set something down and was not certain what his hands were for without it. Maren looked at Shaw first. "How did he know where I was?" Shaw answered carefully. "We received a call this afternoon from a Dr. Ellison. He said he was your program physician and that you had missed a scheduled check-in for the first time in 4 years. Shaw paused. "He said you would need to hear certain things tonight rather than after an official process made them impossible to say. He said the Admiral would know what that meant." Another pause shorter. "He also said to tell you the tree is still standing." Maren was quiet for a moment. The tree. She had not known about the tree. 4 years of 72-hour check-ins, and Dr. Ellison had carried that detail without telling her, had held it in reserve for a moment when it would do more than comfort, when it would land with the specific weight of evidence that the people who thought she was gone had not simply grieved and moved on, but had built something intended to last 500 years. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." Shaw remained in the corridor. She closed the door. The quarters were small enough that 2 people standing in them required spatial negotiation. Voss stood near the door. Maren sat on the edge of her bunk, which put her below his eye level, and she stayed there deliberately because she was not interested in the geometry of dominance, and because she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Voss stood for a moment. He was not, she could see, a man who had done this often, not because he lacked the capacity for difficult conversations, but because his entire professional architecture had been built around not needing to have them. He began to speak. He did not apologize. He had not come to apologize, or not primarily. He had come to say something harder than an apology, something that an apology would have been a way of avoiding. He spoke carefully the way people speak when they have thought about what they want to say and are still not certain the words are adequate. He said he had read the third page of her file. He said he knew what his name meant on that page. He said he had known since approximately 6 months after the operation that the intelligence assessment had been flawed, had known in the general way that inquiries produce general knowledge, but had not known the specific chain by which his review had been one of the links. He said the inquiry's systemic findings had been in his assessment at the time, a reasonable institutional response to a complex failure. He said he understood now that this assessment had been, among other things, a way of not following the chain to its individual links. He said he had spent 4 years applying maximum pressure to everyone around him and calling it standards. He said he understood now what he had actually been doing with that pressure. He stopped speaking. The room was quiet for a long time. Maren looked at him with the steady attention she had brought to the parade ground and the command tent and the long walk back across the asphalt with the folder in her hand, the attention of someone who is not performing their response, but simply having it without the overlay of what they are supposed to feel. She said, "You became the thing you hated most." She said it without inflection, as a statement of observation rather than accusation. "I became invisible trying to survive what that thing does to people. Neither of us won, Admiral." Voss said nothing. There was nothing to say to that, and he seemed to understand this. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with what you've learned today," Maren said. "That's yours. You'll carry it the way people carry things." She paused. "I need to know one thing. Did you know I was here before this morning?" Voss was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the quality of the silence changed. "No," he said. "That is the truth." She held his gaze for another moment, and then she nodded once with the finality of a person closing a drawer they do not intend to open again tonight. The knock at the door came before either of them could speak again. 3 quiet raps. Maren opened the door. Shaw's face held the careful expression of a man managing multiple simultaneous situations. Behind him in the corridor, holding his cover in both hands with the awkwardness of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times and is finding the rehearsal did not fully prepare him, was a man she had not seen in 4 years. He was in his mid-30s, civilian clothes, moving with a slight compensation in his right leg that was barely perceptible, unless you were watching for it, the residual signature of a structural repair done well, but unable to fully erase what had preceded it. His face was older in the way that 4 specific years makes a face older. She knew him without needing the name. Garrett Nolan had been a petty officer first class on the night of March 14th, 2021. He had been in the helicopter when it went into the water. His right leg had been trapped between the collapsed seat frame and the fuselage wall in a position that had made self-extraction impossible, and that had been, in the accounting of that night, the reason she had gone back the 3rd time. Voss moved past her and out of the room. He did not look at Nolan. He and Shaw moved together down the corridor and were gone. Nolan stepped into the doorway. "Commander Cole, you can call me Maren." "I'm not sure I can," he said. "I've been practicing, and I'm not sure I can." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope, personal letter size, thick with pages. Her name written on the front in handwriting she did not recognize. "There are 12 letters inside," Nolan said. "One from each of us. We wrote them about a year after. Some of us rewrote them. The address took a long time to find and then longer to confirm." He held it out. "We heard you had one. We didn't know if you'd opened it." She had one. She looked at the footlocker. She had been carrying it for 6 months, had held it in her hands so many times that the paper had begun to show the handling at the corners. She took the envelope from Nolan. "You don't have to read it now," he said. "You don't have to read it ever if that's what you need. We just needed you to have it." She sat on the edge of her bunk. Nolan sat in the chair at the desk, the logbook still open to its blank page. He did not speak. He understood with the instinct of someone who has spent time in situations where speaking is not the primary available tool that she needed the silence. She opened the footlocker. She took out the envelope she had been carrying for 6 months. She put it beside the one Nolan had brought and looked at them together. Then she picked up the one she had been carrying, the one with the multiple forwarding stamps and the yellowed edges and the adhesive that had been giving slightly every time she pressed her thumb to it for 6 months without committing. She opened it. The adhesive gave completely, this time cleanly, as though it had been waiting for this specific application of pressure and was relieved to have it arrive. Inside were pages. The handwriting changed from page to page. Some hands were careful and deliberate, the writing of people who had composed this over many attempts. Some were less careful, the writing of people who had stopped trying to find the perfect words and had simply put down the ones that were there. She read. She read the first page and then the second and then the third. She read without stopping. The words described the water and the dark and the cold from the inside, from the perspective of people who had been in it and who had heard a voice through all of it, clear and operational, and directing them towards specific actions in the specific way that keeps people functional when functionality is what stands between them and the alternative. The words described the moment when the voice stopped being there and what that meant and what they had carried since. She read the page from the man whose leg had been trapped. It was short. It said, "You went back." It said, "I have a daughter. Her name is Rosie. She is 3 years old. She will not know your name because I do not know if I am allowed to tell her. But she exists because you went back, and I think about that every single morning when I hear her moving around in her room before she's ready to come out, and I will think about it every morning for the rest of my life." She read to the end. All 12 signatures on the final page, different hands, different pressures, 12 people who had arrived at the same piece of paper from different directions. Maren sat on the edge of her bunk with the letter in her hands, and she was quiet for a long time. Then something in the controlled architecture of her composure shifted in a way she could not manage back into position. It was not dramatic. It was simply the specific moment at which the weight of something becomes greater than the structure containing it, quietly without theater, the way a seam gives. She cried. Not with sound or not much. The way people cry when they have been not crying for a very long time and the muscles involved have become unfamiliar with the motion. Nolan sat in the chair and did not look away and did not speak and did not move toward her or away from her, understanding that what she needed from him was exactly what he was providing, which was the witness of someone who was allowed to see this and who would not require anything from it. After a while, she was done. She folded the letters carefully. She placed them on top of the footlocker. Then she sat quietly. "How's the leg?" she said. "Good. Better than they thought. I run. Not the kind of running we used to do, but running." "And the daughter?" "Rosie." His face changed in the way that faces change when certain names are said. "She started asking questions about what I did before I was a dad. I don't know how to answer yet, but I'm working on it." "You'll find the words," Maren said. "They don't have to be perfect. They just have to be honest about what you're able to say." Nolan looked at her for a moment. "The others want to meet. All 12 of us. No agenda, no ceremony. Just us. When you're ready. If you're ever ready." He stood and picked up his cover. "No pressure on the timeline. We've been patient. We can keep being patient." She walked him to the door. "Why did you really come?" she said. "You could have mailed the letter." Nolan was quiet for the moment. "Because I needed to see that you were still here," he said. 4 years is a long time to wonder." He left. She stood in the doorway until his footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she closed the door and stood with her back against it in the specific silence of a room that has just held something large and is now returning to its ordinary dimensions. She looked at the footlocker. She opened it. She took out the compass first. She held it in the late light filtering through the window. The man whose initials she had filed away had been a logistics officer, not a shooter, not someone whose name appeared in classified briefings or medal citations. He had managed supply chains for 3 deployments and had done it with the specific excellence of someone who understood that the difference between a good logistics officer and a poor one was sometimes the difference between people coming home and people not. He had given her the compass on a night when she was 26 years old and did not yet fully understand what he was trying to tell her about direction. She understood it now. She set the compass on the desk in a shaft of late afternoon light, face up the way you leave something when you are no longer trying to protect yourself from seeing it. Then she took out the dive watch. She looked at the encrypted phone for a long time. 4 years, 62 check-ins roughly, 72 hours between each one, a number she had chosen because it was short enough to be manageable and long enough to feel like she was choosing to contact someone rather than being required to. The number on the other end had never once failed to receive. In 4 years, Dr. Ellison had sent 2 messages in return, both of them single words. The first received, the second here. The phone had been for 4 years the narrowest possible thread between who she was and the world that still held a version of her identity. It had been enough. It had been in some ways exactly enough, no more connection than she could sustain, no less than she needed to not disappear entirely. She did not need it anymore. She walked to the trash can by the door and set the phone inside it carefully, the way you set something down when you are finished with it rather than discarding it. There was a difference. She wanted to observe the difference. Then she picked up the dive watch. The metal was cold against her palm, heavy and real expensive tactical grade, designed to function at depths most people would never approach. She had worn it on every mission for 6 years. It had been on her wrist when the helicopter went down, when she went back into the water, when she pulled incapacitated bodies through the darkness and cold. She turned it over. Coordinates engraved on the back. 32.8597 north, 6.9260 west. The exact location off the coast of Morocco, where she had made the choice that defined everything that followed, where one version of Maren Cole had ended and another had begun. She put the watch on her wrist for the first time in 4 years. The weight of it was strange after so long, unfamiliar and right simultaneously, the sensation of reclaiming something she had set aside in a moment of necessary survival and was now retrieving because the moment had changed. The metal warmed against her skin, adapting to her body temperature, becoming part of her again. She opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote in precise script, identity revealed. Purpose unchanged. Mission continues. Then below it, not in shorthand, just words. Being seen is not the same as being known. Being known is not the same as being understood. But you cannot get from one to the other without passing through them in order. She looked at the 2 lines for a moment. Then she closed the book and aligned it precisely with the edge of the desk. The recognition ceremony took place 3 days later in Rear Admiral Diana Holt's conference room, a space that held 12 people comfortably and was chosen for exactly that reason. No parade ground, no formation of 5,000. A conference table, 12 chairs. Morning light coming through windows on the eastern wall, a room that was the appropriate size for what it was being asked to contain. Maren stood at attention in her Logistics Corps uniform, the same one. She had considered this choice and made it deliberately because the uniform was accurate and because accuracy mattered to her in ways she did not always have language for. The dive watch was on her wrist. She had been wearing it since the evening Nolan left, had woken with it 2 mornings in a row and noted each time the quality of its weight familiar and strange simultaneously. Holt stood at the head of the table with the citation document. She was a woman in her early 60s with gray hair and the bearing of someone whose career had included its own negotiations with cost and continuation, and she read the citation with the formal clarity it deserved, not adding anything to it, simply letting the words do what they were designed to do. The citation described a helicopter. It described water and hostile territory in darkness in conditions of temperature that the document rendered in precise clinical language that was more powerful for its restraint. It described 3 extractions. It described 12 personnel recovered. It described injuries sustained, permanent hearing loss, spinal compression fractures, soft tissue damage requiring surgical intervention across multiple procedures. The officers present rendered honors. Maren accepted them with the same bearing she had maintained on the parade ground, steady, present, without theater. She shook hands. She answered questions carefully and briefly. Holt approached her privately when most of the others had stepped away. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Holt said. "The visibility." "No," Maren said, "but I understand why it's necessary. There are going to be people who want to interview you. Journalists. Other officers." Holt said this carefully. "You have control over what you participate in. That hasn't changed." "What are you going to do next?" Holt asked. Maren considered the question. Outside the windows, the base was conducting its ordinary operations in the ordinary morning light, and the helicopters were doing their circuits over the bay, and the personnel were moving between their duty stations with the purposeful efficiency of people who have places to be. "Teach," Maren said. "I'm going to keep teaching." Holt nodded. "I've made your assignment here permanent and expanded the scope to include formal instruction responsibilities. Leadership development, crisis management, operational logistics, planning." She paused. "Your identity remains your choice to manage." Her encrypted phone had been in the trash can since the night Nolan visited. What it registered no longer concerned her. What arrived instead was a formal document routed through Holt's office from an office she recognized. The Medal of Honor recommendation was being resubmitted. The officer initiating the resubmission was the flag officer who had overseen the original denial 4 years ago. The accompanying note said that he was ill, that he had perhaps 6 months remaining, and that there were several things he intended to correct before that time expired, and that this was the most significant. She read the document completely. She read it twice. She wrote 1 word on the routing slip and returned it through official channels. Declined. The word was not an act of bitterness. She had examined it carefully before she sent it, held it up to the light the way you hold something to check its composition, and what she found in it was not bitterness, and was not false modesty, and was not the residue of 4 years of resentment that had not fully resolved. What she found was something simpler and more durable. The recommendation belonged to the institution that had generated and denied and was now attempting to regenerate it, and that institution had specific uses for that category of acknowledgement, and she understood those uses and did not dismiss them, but they were not her uses. What she needed from her service was not a document from the people who had buried the first document. What she needed, she was already in the process of building slowly and without ceremony. In the warehouse, in the classroom, in the corridor, conversations with young sailors who were trying to understand what they had signed up for. She went to find Seaman Tessa Van. She found her on the parade ground, not alone. 7 other junior sailors stood with Van at the edge of the asphalt in the late afternoon light, the core of the logistics training group she had been working with for several weeks. They had the slightly self-conscious posture of people who have agreed to something and are not certain it was a good idea. Van was the one who had suggested it. Maren understood this without being told because Van had the specific quality of someone who generates motion in groups by the force of her own willingness to be the first one to move. Maren had come to the parade ground because she wanted to stand on it when it was empty and let it be what it was, which was asphalt and paint and the residual heat of a day that was almost done. A place where something had happened, and that was now again simply a place. She stood at the spot where she had been standing that morning, not marking it, not memorializing it, just standing on it the way you stand on ground that you want to reclaim from the meaning other people's actions have tried to assign to it. The students approached with the careful respect of people who understand they are joining something they did not initiate. Van spoke for them. "Ma'am, we hoped we might find you here." Maren looked at them. 8 young faces in the California evening light, the specific combination of uncertainty and earnestness that she had learned to read as the signature of people who are trying to figure out what they are made of and have not yet accumulated enough data. "You have questions," Maren said. "One question," Van said, "if that's okay." Garrett Nolan had asked her why she went back the 3rd time. She had answered him with the truth about counting, about the arithmetic of who was still in the water, about the fact that the 3rd descent had not been a decision in the deliberate sense that the word implies, but rather the continuation of a process that had not yet reached its conclusion. Van's question was different. "What did it feel like," Van said, "to be invisible for 4 years, to know who you were and have nobody else know?" The evening light was doing what evening light does in coastal California, turning everything amber, softening the institutional edges of the base into something that looked almost peaceful from a certain angle. The helicopters were still running their circuits. The water beyond the fence was going dark. Maren thought about the footlocker, about the 3 objects and the morning she had stood in front of them and closed the lid and spun the lock. She thought about the check-ins every 72 hours, the precise mechanical ritual of transmitting a number into a secure network and receiving almost nothing back, the way that routine had become over 4 years, something close to human contact without being human contact. She thought about the warehouse shelves arranged by operational priority for a base that had last mobilized in 2019, about the quiet satisfaction of a system that made sense even when no one else understood why it made sense. "Safe," she said, "and very, very small." Van absorbed this. The other students absorbed it. The phrase landed in the particular way that honest answers land without excess, with enough weight to stay. "You could have stayed invisible," Van said. "Even after today, you could have requested transfer, started over somewhere else." "Yes," Maren said. "Why didn't you?" Maren looked at the parade ground, at the asphalt and the painted lines marking the positions of 5,000 people who were not here now and would be here again and would stand in this heat and this formation discipline and eventually rotate out to whatever came next in their service. "Because the moment I walked off this parade ground this morning," she said, "the answer to that question changed." She paused. "You spend enough time building a wall, and eventually you can't remember whether you built it to keep things out or to keep yourself in." The students were quiet. Maren looked at Van. "What made you want to be logistics?" Van blinked. She had not been expecting the question to reverse direction. "Honestly, I tested well for it. I'm good at systems. I like figuring out how things move." "Then you're in the right place," Maren said. "Not because it's what you tested for, because that's what this work actually is. How things move, how you make sure they keep moving when conditions go wrong." She looked at all of them. Every operation anyone in this building has ever run or will ever run depends on people who understand that. Not peripherally, centrally, The people out front don't make it home without the people who understood the systems. She looked down at the watch on her wrist. The metal had been warm all day from contact with her skin. The coordinates on the back were not visible from this angle, but she knew they were there: 32.8597 north, 6.9260 west. The location off the Moroccan coast where she had understood something about herself that she had been learning toward for her entire adult life. What she had learned was not that she was capable of going back 3 times. She had known she was capable of that, or she would not have done it. What she had learned was what she did it for. Not for the institution, not for the commendation that had been generated and denied and was now being declined, not for the mythology of it which had been growing in the classified briefing rooms of naval special warfare for 4 years without her knowledge or consent. She had done it because they were still in the water. That was all. The reason was that simple and that complete, and it had not changed in 4 years, and it would not change. "Go home," she told them. "Come back tomorrow and we'll work the crisis logistics exercise I set up for Friday. It's harder than the last one." "How much harder?" one of the male sailors said. "Hard enough that you'll think you're not going to finish it," she said. "And then you will, because that's what happens when you know your systems." They dispersed with the energy of people who have been given permission to stop being serious for the evening. Van was the last to go. She stopped a few feet away and turned back. "Ma'am, for what it's worth." She paused, working out how to finish the sentence. "I'm glad you stopped being invisible." She went without waiting for a response, which was the right call. Maren stood on the parade ground alone. The light was almost gone. The bay beyond the fence had gone from dark gray to the particular blue-black of coastal water at dusk, the color that looks like depth rather than surface. The helicopters had completed their circuits and gone quiet. The base was transitioning to evening operations with the smooth efficiency of long-practiced routine. She thought about Reed. She had not seen him since the parade ground. She knew he was still on base, had heard his name mentioned in the informal accounting of what had happened and who had done what and in what order. She knew he had been the first to salute, had broken formation. To do it had held the salute in the direction she had walked, even after she was out of sight. She had not sought him out. She was not certain she would. What he was carrying from this morning was his to carry the specific weight of almost of the decision made in the formation to stay in formation, while something wrong was happening, of the rehearsal of what he should have done that would continue long after the incident was formally closed. That weight was not something she could lift from him. It was also not punishment. It was instruction of the kind that does not come from classrooms or training courses, the kind that arrives unbidden and stays. She hoped he would learn what it was trying to teach him. She hoped she had learned what the last 4 years had been trying to teach her. She was not certain yet. That was honest. The integration she had described to Nolan, the past and present existing together without either one erasing the other, was a process rather than a destination, a thing you moved toward rather than arrived at. She was moving toward it. That was more than she had been able to say 6 months ago. She walked back to her quarters. On her desk, the brass compass in a shaft of light face up no longer turned away from its own history. The framed letter from 12 people who were alive. The logbook open to the page where she had written 2 things, one in military shorthand and one in plain words. The dive watch warm on her wrist at the end of a day that had changed the shape of everything. She sat in the chair and looked at what was on the desk and thought about what it meant that these things were visible now instead of locked in a box. Small changes, the kind that do not announce themselves. She opened the logbook to a fresh page. She thought about the 5,000 people on the parade ground that morning and the specific quality of the silence when Voss struck her the way that silence was not the silence of people who did not understand what they were witnessing, but the silence of people who understood exactly and did not yet know what to do with the understanding. She thought about Reed's almost. She thought about what Van had said, the gladness, the straightforward expression of something Maren had not expected to produce in anyone, that her visibility might be something worth being glad about. She had spent 4 years calibrating herself to leave no mark, to pass through institutional spaces without residue, to be useful without being known. It had been in its way a form of service. But service conducted entirely in the absence of connection had costs she had not been accounting for. Costs paid not only by her but by the people who might have benefited from the version of her that was present instead of the version that was hiding. She did not write anything else tonight. Outside, the last light was leaving the California sky. The water in the bay would be doing what water does in the absence of light, continuing its motion, without an audience, the same motion it had been executing since long before any of this happened, and would continue executing long after all of it was memory. She was still here. 4 years after a night when the accounting suggested she should not be, she was still here, and the people she had gone back for were still here, and Reed was somewhere on this base learning to live with almost, and Nolan's daughter was asleep in a room that existed because of a decision made in cold water and darkness that was not in the end a complicated decision at all. She was still here, and she had work to do tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, work that looked like supply manifests and classroom instruction, and the daily practice of showing up in the specific way that the people around her needed her to show up. This was enough. Not in the diminished sense of enough, not in the sense of settling for what remained after something larger was lost. In the full sense. The sense of sufficient, of adequate to the actual requirement of fitted correctly to the present shape of things. Maren Cole put on the watch every morning after that. Not as a reminder of what had happened off the coast of Morocco. She did not need a reminder. It had happened, and it was part of her, and it was not going anywhere, which was neither a tragedy nor a triumph, but simply the nature of experience. The way it accretes into the structure of a person and becomes indistinguishable from the structure itself. She put on the watch because it was hers, because she had earned the weight of it, because some things that were taken from you or that you set aside in a moment of necessary survival can be reclaimed when the moment changes. And reclaiming them is not nostalgia and is not regression, but is simply the honest acknowledgement that you are still the person who earned them, changed and continuous both. In the classrooms at Naval Air Station Coronado, the students learned to think about logistics the way someone had once taught Maren Cole to think about it, as the structure that makes everything else possible, as the invisible architecture of operational success as work that is serious in proportion to how little it requires you to announce your seriousness. They learned from an instructor who had stood on a parade ground and not fallen. They learned from someone who understood the difference between enduring something and being defined by it. And on the evenings when the helicopters ran their circuits over the bay and the sound of the rotors carried through the classroom windows, the instructor paused briefly and then continued. And the students learned from that too, from the pause and from the continuation, both without being told what they were learning, which was the only way the lesson worked. On a morning in early November, Maren returned to the parade ground before anyone else arrived. The asphalt was empty. The painted lines marked the positions of people who were not yet there. The air smelled of salt and the particular cold of a California morning that has not yet decided to be warm. She stood on the spot. She stood there for a long time, not marking it, not memorializing it, simply occupying it the way you occupy ground that you have decided belongs to you again. Then she turned and walked back toward the classrooms. Her step was the same step she had always had, the one that could not be fully suppressed regardless of what uniform she was wearing, the operator's economy of motion, purposeful and precise. But it was not hidden anymore. It was simply how she walked.